He was the King of England, the most eligible bachelor in the world, and then he gave it all up for love. This is the abdication of Edward VIII, Part 2. When last we left our story, Edward had met a twice-divorced American, Wallis Simpson. She was not considered suitable for the future Queen of England, but Edward was smitten and would have none of that. He wanted to marry her. Parliament said no. The Prime Minister said no. The Archbishop of Canterbury said no. Even his own family said no. But Edward would not be swayed. And so in 1936 he made an announcement. He would abdicate the throne unless Parliament passed laws to allow him to marry Miss Simpson. Parliament said, "Are you sure?" And Edward said, "I'm sure enough." So they did it. They passed the law. And then, oops, he didn't want to marry her after all. Now, let me say this.
Ow.
No one thought this through very carefully. The Abdication Crisis of 1936 was not a well-rehearsed production. It was not some carefully laid plan hatched by a team of publicists and speechwriters. This was a series of events that caught everyone off guard, including Edward himself. He had no sooner become the figurehead of a new political party than he changed his mind about marrying Wallis Simpson. What now? Well, the Prime Minister asked if perhaps they could find someone else for Edward to marry, someone who could play the role of the perfect royal bride. But it was too late. Edward was besotted with Wallis and would hear of no other. Not only that, but he was furious at how Parliament had been dragged into his personal life. He felt they had betrayed him. So when George VI came to power, their relationship was a chilly one. Edward lived a quiet life at his royal lodge in Windsor, spending his days hunting, driving his beloved Rolls-Royces, and having secret meetings with his former flame. Yes, you heard me right, his former flame. You see, while he had not married Wallis, he wasn't prepared to just let her go. When he proposed to her in January of 1937, she turned him down. She didn't want to be a royal footnote. She didn't want to be the twice-divorced American. She wanted to be Mrs. Simpson. And so Edward sent her on her way with a peerage and a sizable allowance. A little over a year later, she married another man. Edward had lost his girl, but clearly he was not going to lose interest. In May of 1938, he began a secret affair with a young woman named Frida Dudley. That same month, he flew to France and surprised Wallis and her new husband at their villa. He stayed there for 2 weeks, holding court on the terrace, as his entourage kept watch for photographers. Then it was back to England for Edward, where he carried on a passionate affair with Frida. By September, she was pregnant, but Edward insisted that they keep it a secret. When Frida miscarried, he was beside himself with grief. His doctors warned him that his health was failing and urged him to take a long vacation. He went to Kenya. While he was gone, Frida returned to England, broken-hearted and pregnant again. Once more, Edward insisted that they keep it a secret. Once more, she miscarried. By the end of 1939, Frida was exhausted and frightened, and she had had enough. She was certain that she was going to miscarry once more, and she didn't want to do that alone. She needed support, but Edward was nowhere to be found. He was on vacation in Egypt. As soon as he returned to England, Frida confronted him and demanded that they get married. She was done with secrets. Now, obviously, this was a problem. Edward couldn't marry her. For one thing, the Church of England didn't allow divorce. For another, his younger brother George had recently become king. And finally, Parliament would never approve. So Edward did what any normal person would do in that situation, offered her money to keep quiet. But Frida had had enough of Edward and his secrets. She wanted a real relationship, and so she took her story to the press. Newspapers around the world ran headlines about Edward's illegitimate child and his plans to marry the young woman who bore it. His doctors were horrified. They knew that his heart was not up to this sort of stress. Edward was rushed to the hospital and put to bed. He remained there for the next 6 months, suffering from a series of ailments that included high blood pressure, bronchitis, and a perforated ulcer. By the time he was released from the hospital, his doctors ordered him to take things slowly. No more scandals, no more excitement. In fact, they told him that he should really cut back on the drama in his life. And who better to help him do that than his old flame Wallis Simpson? By now, she was divorced again. And although Edward was forbidden to marry her, the doctors thought that she could help calm him down. She moved into his royal lodge at Windsor, ostensibly as a friend. Within a week, however, newspapers were reporting that she was running the household, receiving guests and acting as the king's hostess. It was a scandal, but this time the public largely approved. The former king had been a national figurehead, and he had failed. In his place, George VI had come along and done an admirable job during the war. But George was no monarch by inclination. He loved his country, but he hated the responsibility of kingship. If anyone could bring him happiness, it was his older brother, Edward. And so the public turned a blind eye to the former king and his former flame living together in sin. But it wasn't just the public that was turning a blind eye. King George was doing it too. He was so busy running a war that he had little time to pay attention to his brother's domestic arrangements. He did send for them once to tell them to behave, but the admonishment apparently went in one ear and out the other. In 1947, King George died. Edward was next in line. He was 62 years old. Everyone wondered if he would learn from the mistakes of the past and choose a suitable bride and produce an heir. After all, the doctors had told him to keep it in his pants. The new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, asked Edward if he intended to marry. Edward said, "Why not?" But then he learned that there were two conditions attached to his accession. First, he had to sign away his fortune, which was far greater than the royal allowance. Second, he couldn't marry Wallis, so Edward abdicated once more. He chose his mistress over the crown, becoming the first British monarch to do so since 17th century. King Charles I, Edward was created Duke of Windsor. He married Duchess Wallis, and they spent their honeymoon at her villa in France. There they remained until Edward's death in 1972. He was buried alongside his parents. But without the fanfare of a royal funeral, his widow survived him by 14 years. She died in 1986. She was 80 years old. Now, if you want to know more about the Abdication Crisis of 1936 or the turbulent reign of George VI, check out the series in the description below. Or if it's more the shenanigans of a young monarchy that floats your boat, then try the series in the description below. And as always, if you want to learn more about the history of royalty, stay tuned for more information.